Department of Wildlife. It's really been a pleasure to work with this zoo and this committee over the past, wow, it's almost been 10 years, one of my enjoyable jobs, we do a lot of fun stuff. I tell Gretchen this is my most productive committee. I think we get as much done on this committee more than we do on many others. With the grants and the lecture series. So I helped to organize the lecture series. And it's really my pleasure, my honor tonight to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Mark Colwell. So I arrived here about 15 years ago, and Mark was here, served as my mentor when I first arrived, is our senior most faculty member in the department. I don't have to reveal how long that's been, but you know, it's been a few decades. And you may be familiar with Dr. Colwell's work. He's been working here on the North Coast on the population of shorebirds since he arrived several decades ago, and really has also already given a lecture at our first annual seminar conservation series here at the zoo, talking about his snowy plover work that he's been doing on the coast. What's exciting, many things are exciting about tonight's talk, I think. One of the exciting things about passing the basket and so forth is that Mark was a recipient of one of our conservation grants to help support these surveys that he's going to present to you tonight. And what I think is very exciting about this work is that he went out to do some systematic surveys of shorebirds on the coast and counted many, many of them, and they had some great conservation implications for Humboldt Bay and surrounds. So please help me welcome Mark Colwell.
Several decades. 1989 to be precise, which is fine. I'm very happy to be here, and if I look back to when I was a grad student in North Dakota, looking for my first job, Humboldt was on the map for me because I grew up in Portland, and it was like one of those places I dreamed I could finally be, and luck went my way. And I ended up here as a lecturer and then got a tenure-track position. Let me just acknowledge somebody who way back when played a large role in my life. Stanley Harris passed away about 2 months ago, and Stan was a good friend. He was a role model and a mentor. And I traveled with him birding in Costa Rica, and some of the work that I will talk about tonight has relevance to things that he did way back when he first got here several decades before I did. If you knew Stan, great man. And I'm sorry that he's not here with us anymore. He's a friend of the birds and a friend of birders and a friend of mine. In honor of Stan, these birds and a lot of people played a role in the counting. You said I counted the birds, but nope. I mean, I did a little, but there are people in the audience who I'm looking at that played a role in the surveys that I'm going to talk about. All these names are those, plus some people affiliated with the groups that you see there. I have to acknowledge certainly the Sequoia Conservation Fund for their funding of especially the travel that put all these people, you know, around the bay on 14 different occasions over the course of a full year to quantify the importance of the bay to shorebirds. And the importance here is all about the numbers. So I'm going to talk about diversity and abundances. And it's this army that I should acknowledge played a large role in the field, and others who continue to play a role, Chelsea and Hannah Lowinter, Chelsea Polity, and Lizzie Foyt up there probably stand out as people in the lab that I have that are still working on this with me. So, on to the topic, and I'll acknowledge that none of the photos are mine. No, I'm a terrible photographer, so you'll see Leslie's name affiliated with a fair number of these photos, and I could start with a quiz, but I won't. Diversity and abundance, and I'm going to set the stage on a global level by talking about migration in the context of flyways, and then convince you of the importance of Humboldt Bay in terms of the diversity and the estimates of abundance that we ended up with after this year-long bit of work, and then turn to the conservation implications. And surprisingly, these numbers only scratch the surface, I think, at the importance of the bay, and they also lead to questions that are unanswered that really are challenging. All right, so the shorebirds that I've studied for several decades
He's not happy.
are part of the waterbird community of birds that occupies the bay. And I said that when I came here, I was darn lucky to get this position as a lecturer and then a tenure track faculty member. I was aware of how important Humboldt Bay was to birds in general, but shorebirds in particular, based on Stan Harris's work with his students and the literature that they have published. But just in terms of account of the total number of species of waterbirds, I think you could argue that this number actually is higher than the 36.7 that's shown here. This is sort of the regular assemblage of shorebirds, different species that you might encounter here on Humboldt Bay in any one year, but there's more surprising data to come. Anyway, shorebirds are diverse here, and I'm going to convince you on how wonderful Humboldt Bay is with the statistic a little bit down the road. All right, so the flyway concept you probably heard of, right? And it dates to over a century ago in the context of waterfowl management. A fellow named Cook was the original individual who worked on this concept of managing hunted populations, waterfowl, that move between breeding and non-breeding areas along these distinct flyways. So that was championed further in the 50s by Lincoln. Again, hunted populations, and what you're looking at happen to be the 9 flyways for shorebirds as non-hunted. Most of them are non-hunted species, at least in North America. That's how we view them. And so the colors represent those different flyways. And here we are on the Pacific Americas flyway here, which is basically stretching from western Alaska down the Pacific coast of North and Central and South America. So there is a group of species that I'll inform you about shortly that breed in North America and then move to non-breeding habitats along this flyway, and Humboldt Bay happens to be one of the places that they stage, and they also winter as the staging is as they're moving north and south between non-breeding and breeding areas. So a fascinating aspect of the Earth's geography as it relates to these flyways involves the land masses of the Earth, right? They are decidedly northern in their distribution. If you drew a line of the equator, it would be right about through there, Ecuador, hence equator, right? And so you can see this is our biased map in terms of land masses, but if you just ignore the projection, it is true that most of the world's land masses are northern. And so we're talking about populations that breed in the productive spring, summer habitats of the boreal forest and Arctic north of the whole Arctic, and then move south along these flyways to overwinter in areas north and south of the equator. Is there any place in the world where the reverse of that happens, where there's a population of shorebirds that breed in the south and move north? There's one additional flyway that's not shown here, and it's right there. Right? There are a few species of dockerel and things that breed in Patagonia and move north, opposite to what you typically see in the world's flyways for shorebirds, at least. Okay, so that's the flyway concept, these pathways along which populations move. And there's the equator, just for illustration. I'm going to just make mention of what is a paradigm, a way of thinking about the importance of wetlands in the context of these flyways. and it relates to conservation. This staging paradigm applies to places like Humboldt Bay or Mono Lake, which you see here, and that block, that swarm of birds in the background happen to be Wilson's phalarope. This is a highly aquatic sandpiper that stages at Mono Lake. Individuals spend weeks to a month of their summer after they've bred at Mono Lake, chowing down on brine shrimp and brine flies, and they double their mass in anticipation of their next flight on the Flyway south to South America. So this staging paradigm in the conservation of shorebirds has at its foundation this notion that there are these key wetlands that link populations on the annual cycle as they move north and south along flyways. That's the staging paradigm, and it's critical, whether it's Mono Lake or Humboldt Bay, that these sites are protected in conservation sense. So again, the wetlands serve, whether it's Humboldt Bay, this is a shot of the bay with some spring migrating sandpipers just at the Arcata Marsh a couple of years ago. But these birds rely on places like Humboldt Bay as they move north and south. There's also a sizable winter population of birds. And to take this further, it's the impacts at these sites. So if you're familiar with Mono Lake, for instance, there was this controversy over diversion of water back in the 80s by the LA Water District that changed the salinity of that lake and altered the ecosystem such that those brine flies and brine shrimp were in jeopardy, and the populations of shorebirds like Wilson's phalarope, beard grebes also staged there in big numbers. They were vulnerable to that human activity, that habitat change. So keep that in mind, because whether it's the zoo or Audubon, etc., the work that we're doing and the importance is couched in terms of conservation and trying to put a number on Humboldt Bay. All right, so in the context of wetland conservation, there are two main tools by which conservationists protect wetlands. Actually, the Ramsar Convention on the left, named after the city in Iran, where it was first signed in 1971 by a whole bunch of international countries, right? The signatory nations back in 71. Established this convention to protect wetlands of significance, not just to birds, but to lots of other things. So that's on the left here, and the US signed on as a signatory nation in the late 80s or 90s and went about designating places that they'd already protected, like the Everglades. But I'll come back to that because Humboldt Bay should be a Ramsar site, and it currently is not. The other tool, which has no legal teeth to it, it's simply a means by which folks recognize, in the same way that Ramsar recognizes wetlands of importance, is this Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network. It's confined to the Americas, and the number of sites since the original establishment of the system in 1980 is, you see there, 106 and lots of hectares. And each of these dots represents a place somewhere in the Western Hemisphere that is deemed important to shorebirds. All right, important in what way? There are these tiers. The same tiers exist in recognition in Ramsar, but I've just pulled out the Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve criteria, which rely on an estimate of total numbers, or if you really got good information, you know what percentage of a flyway population of any species occur at the site and rely on it as an important staging area. And you'd probably say that Mono Lake, it's a guess, you know, if there are 1 million plus Wilson's phalaropes, there's probably several 100,000 that use Mono Lake, is a guess, right? So that would be an important site, probably a hemispheric site. If we step down, a site that has 100,000 birds minimally and 10% of the flyway population for any species that occurs there, it would be an international site, and then regional is less important, so to speak. So those are the categories. And Chet, where's Chet? Yep, Chet's got his hand up, and I want to acknowledge him as I always do, because Chet was the individual back in '98 with the Redwood Region Audubon Society who went about taking the information and organizing everybody and nominating Humboldt Bay, which the site actually extends down to the Eel River and north into the pastures along the Mad River and everything in between. But Chet, thank you again for the work that you did back then to recognize or make it so that the WHISRN, Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network, went about recognizing Humboldt Bay as a site of international importance. Right? Well, a year ago I gave a talk, or more actually, and the number bumped up by a considerable amount based on the work that all those people did in the second slide with me. In just March, April, and early May of 2018, we demonstrated minimally 500,000 birds here. I've got a question mark in the flyway population sizes because they're still challenging to get at. The number actually is now higher than 500,000 plus because that proposed, the proposal which was accepted by the committee that elevated Humboldt Bay from an international to a hemispheric site was just based on the spring data. So what I'm going to show you tonight is that you add the summer, fall, and the winter data to the spring data, we're closer to 1 million birds. And I think that's conservative. Okay, so there's the Pacific Americas Flyway in various shades of color, green, purple, blue, and orange. And I dug through both Stan Harris's Birds of Northwestern California as the original source to come up with the total number of species of shorebird that have been observed here. And Stan got here in '59, so he was keeping records. And I think they're in the museum now. His notebooks arrived shortly after the new year from Mike, his son. But his books document most of the 52 species that are indicated there that have been observed here on Humboldt Bay. And the numbers vary depending on the month of the year, from as few as 1,000 or a few thousand in May and June to the 500,000 plus birds that I just mentioned in spring alone. And I'm going to show you more details on that. I'll come back to the 52 species. So, Humboldt Bay, it's special. It is really special. If you're at all a geographer and interested in the this flyway, and Google Earth is a wonderful tool, because you can just fly all over the place and look at things, right? But when I was a kid growing up in Portland and spent time on the BC coast, Washington coast, Oregon coast, and now California, there are not many estuaries like Humboldt Bay. Big coastal lagoons, right? In the context of a coastal plain that extends inland a long ways. Like, go north. Where does this occur in Oregon? There's Tillamook Bay. Right? And if you go into Washington, Willapa Bay, Grays Harbor. Go south of here. San Francisco Bay is big. It's not a coastal lagoon, and all right, it's rimmed by urban areas. It is a different habitat. It's got a lot of birds and a lot of species, but there are not many places like Humboldt Bay that combine the tidal lagoon and all that tidal flat that you see measured there in square kilometers. And that's all this orangish brown here is unconsolidated soft sediments that if you got out of your boat and stepped onto that thing, and I had this happen with a student in one of my classes about 20 years ago. We took the pontoon boat out from Woodley Island, got off the pontoon boat, and this guy, kind of heavy set, like me, and short, legs, and he started to go down. If you stop moving, and he started to sink. And it took us forever to get him out. And the photo that somebody took at the time was comical because there was all range of emotions expressed by the individual who was stuck and his teammates. But that's all of this, right? So all of this is low tide, right? And in the middle of the bay, this green illustrates the eelgrass, which is recovering in Arcata Bay. The same situation occurs in South Bay, although this eelgrass bed has long been free of the human impacts associated with oyster culture, which is all of this pink, right? So if you take the tidal flats in that immense area and couple it with rocky intertidal here, the jetties and the riprap at King Salmon and the ocean fronting beaches in blue, and then all of this freshwater or pasture habitat, that habitat diversity and the area, the extent of that area is what drives the special place that is Humboldt Bay for the shorebirds. So not mudflat, right? That's tidal flat, and mud is maybe some part of that, but there's sandy places out there. Anyway. All right, so I'm going to walk you through the assemblage of birds that you might encounter at Humboldt Bay. This is the 52 species, and I'm going to group them first into those 6 that occasionally breed locally, including the snowy plover that I've studied for 20 years, spotted sandpipers along the Man River, the oyster catcher, black oyster catcher out on Trinidad Head. Avocets occasionally breed here, and then killdeer. So all of these are the acronyms that describe these species. 6 of them that breed here. They also breed elsewhere, but there's a local breeding population. That's those 6. Then there's a group of mid-continent. I've got this, the Great Basin, but it extends over the Rockies and into the prairie provinces of Canada and the States. And there are populations of long-billed curlew, willet, and marbled godwit that basically breed in this area and come to the coast to winter. They don't breed here, right? So you can see there's a bunch of them, right? Including the species that I worked on for my PhD, Wilson's phalarope. All right, then if we move north, there's a bunch of sandpipers that are yellowlegs. There's greater yellowlegs. There's a solitary sandpiper that are in boreal forests. Some of these are duplicated like Wilson snipe, but here's another group of 5 species that are really hard to study because they're in the middle of black spruce, northern boreal forests, and nobody knows anything about greater yellowlegs and lesser yellowlegs. All right, Alaska Peninsula. This is interesting. I already showed you a godwit, and it was a population that breeds in the prairies here. There is also a marbled godwit population that I'm going to return to that breeds in Alaska, along with rock sandpiper and black oyster catcher. So these birds migrate down here and spend the time at Humboldt Bay. If you go to western lowland tundra in Alaska, there's a whole bunch of calidridine sandpipers, especially western sandpiper and black turnstones, whose distribution is really restricted to just this area. And they move along the Pacific Americas Flyway also. And then north of the Brooks Range in Alaska, there's a whole bunch of tundra breeding plovers, sandpipers, phalaropes, redneck phalarope, pectoral sandpiper, wimbrel, and American golden plover here. And they are long distance migrants. Some of these species go all the way, I don't even have a map that covers it, to southern South America, or move to Australasia, New Zealand to winter. All right, that's not the, this is Nearctic tundra. There's an additional group that doesn't show up on the map, but imagine Siberia is over here. This is the Bering Strait, right? And so Russia, and there are a whole bunch of vagrant species that occasionally come this way to contribute to the diversity. And they include things like ruffs and wood sandpipers and greenshanks, right? So all of these species converge on Humboldt Bay. Again, 52 species. Well, there are 215 species in the group that we call shorebirds worldwide. So roughly a quarter of the world's shorebirds have been observed on Humboldt Bay. could have ended up in a better place. On shorebirds, seriously. All right, so here is some eBird data that I dug through. You're looking at North America, right? And each of these dots, there are 27 of them, represent estuaries along mostly the United States. We're crazy birders, and some of you are in the room right now, right? Including me, chase species. And what I did was used eBird, and especially the bar chart, which is broken down into the months of the year, to basically say, all right, if I take Eisenbeck Lagoon up there and look at its eBird data, how many species occur there in the winter? Do the same for Kachemak Bay and the Homer Spit there, and up at Anchorage and continue at Fraser River Delta down the Skagit and all the way down to Oregon, Washington, Oregon, California coast into Baja. There's a Panama and a Costa Rica site. It's hard to get data actually from that's rich enough to be comfortable that you're actually confident that the data say something. And I tried to predict diversity, or the number of species, based on 3 variables that I thought a priori beforehand might be important. Latitude. Well, okay, this is an ecological law. In fact, that Alexander von Humboldt, he's the one who first articulated that law. He also articulated a species-area relationship. I'm talking about 2 centuries ago. He wrote about it in his writings. So latitude I was interested in, and no surprise, there's that relationship. This is Panama and Costa Rica, and in the winter as you move north, you get fewer and fewer species. See the red dot? Right? It's latitude, and I also put human population in there because I reasoned that, well, even in this day of travel, that birders of high density might find more birds than a place that doesn't have many people and birders, right? I think CJ, you used some ABA number of members in a prior analysis that I saw you talk about at Godwit days. So what turns out is that there is a significant latitudinal trend, and if you look at that red dot, that's Humboldt Bay. Should have an arrow going right there, right? So that arrow, thank you, Chelsea. My grad student did this analysis. 3 more species in the winter than you would expect given its latitude and its population size, right? I'm still counting that as, thumbs up on this is a special place for shorebirds. All right, so let me just turn to the seasonal patterns that we observed in the full year surveys that all those people did with us. So I'm going to break this down into roughly the southbound migration, which begins in late June, and there are birds that continue to migrate into this area, and things finally settle down in late October, even November. Then there's a winter period of November, December, January, February, in which we did surveys every month. And then the spring period of March, April, and May, when things start really moving. And what you see are 3-week intervals, 1 month and 2 week. And this was to account for the fact that during migration, individuals don't stay in one place for very long, especially in the spring. They're moving fast, heading north to breeding areas. It's typically slower when the birds are coming south, and it's a little bit more protracted, so it's a 3-week interval between the consecutive surveys that we did. This was also driven by the timing of low tides. It's challenging to get this logistically figured out. So what's shown here is that in June, the first survey was this is kind of backwards, but we did summer, fall last. And so what you see in an annual cycle is the low numbers of both total abundances as well as diversity is in June. There's a few thousands of birds here on the bay, and things like marbled godwits and willets, etc., are here, right? So that's 12 species. And then over the course of the fall, summer-fall migration, those numbers typically increase. In the winter here, we have 20 to 25 species, depending on the survey, and then it increases slightly again in the spring when birds are rolling full through very fast. So over the total work that we did, 31 species detected of the 52 that have been recorded at any time in the Humboldt Bay area. Some rarities too. All right, so here is the results of the total, right? You can see that number is, it's big, bigger than the 500,000 plus that I said earlier, elevated the site to a hemispheric site under Wissern. I think that's a conservative number, 875,000. And so what's shown here again is that in June, most of the birds that are here now are somewhere else breeding in the prairies, in the boreal forests, and the tundra of the north, right? So not many species and not many individuals, but come July, the first waves of southbound adults that have failed in breeding in those breeding habitats are moving through, and then come the other adults who have successfully bred, and then the juveniles accompany them south. The numbers here in the winter, about 50,000 of that's, assemblage of 25, 30 species. And then in the spring, you can see these pulses, especially in mid to late April. The timing of Godwit days, that festival, is perfect in that it coincides with this pulse. And a couple springs back, a bunch of us were at the marsh on a beautiful sequence of a week of evenings where the tide was just right, the weather was perfect, and independently, a bunch of the observers who were listed earlier sat there with me, and we weren't talking to one another, but we were estimating independently what was the total number of birds that we had on any one day at the marsh, and we did this for a good week plus, and it was 100 to 200,000 just at the marsh, right? Moving into I'm talking about the Arcata Marsh, these estimates of 100 to 200,000 were just that area, and we didn't have knowledge about other places in the bay. There certainly were large numbers of bird staging also. So here are the winter data, and I'm sorry for the codes here, but they're shorthand for Dunlin, Western Sandpipers, Least Sandpipers, Marble God. I'm not going to go through every one of them, but they rank the species that make up the winter assemblage of shorebirds here, and there's 25, 30 species, right? In terms of their abundances, right? These histograms indicate that Dunlin probably number 20,000 plus birds here from November through February. Western sandpipers are also very abundant, as are leasts. And so these are what people call peeps, right? Birders call them peeps, right? At a distance, you're looking through your binoculars, there's a big, massive flock, peep, right? They're calendridine sandpipers, small sandpipers, but you can see that these three species comprise, this dashed line shows well over 90% of the total population of shorebirds is these three species. So I've got down here, not mudflat, but tidal flat, because I think one of the reasons we have so many species here is there's a diverse habitat offered in the earlier colored figure, tidal flat, the eelgrass, sandy beaches, rocky intertidal pastures. But it's the tidal flats and the immense area of that unconsolidated soft sediment that attracts and keeps these large numbers of these small sandpipers here. These species, if you're familiar, this is rock sandpiper, wandering tattler. If you go to the jetty right now, surf's down, go out on the jetty at a low tide, you'll find one or two of those there. Well, the area isn't that extensive. So this is a simple argument, but I think it relates to the overall size of the lagoon that is Humboldt Bay, and the fact that on twice a day, this tidal exchange exposes this immense area upon which these species feed. It hasn't rained much lately. This is a dry February. Those pastures that were yellow around the bay are important alternative habitats for many of these species. when the bay habitats are covered with water, for instance. So that may play into it too. Okay, let me just talk about some case studies, beginning with one of the smaller sandpipers. This is a peep. And so western sandpipers, the number there is 3.5 million is the estimated population size. They all breed in the lowlands of the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta right there. And then during migration, they fan out in spring and fall across the mostly western U.S. to winter in coastal habitats as shown by blue. So there's central Washington, there are a few at the the Fraser River here at Vancouver in the winter. But they're mostly from about 50 degrees north latitude down to about, it's probably 20 degrees south latitude in their winter distribution in coastal estuaries like Humboldt Bay. And it is the rock star in terms of total numbers of birds that use Humboldt Bay. 500,000 is a minimum estimate based on the spring counts that we did 2 years ago, and that represents roughly 15% of the population in April alone. Unfortunately, I can't be any more precise about what the winter population or the summer-fall populations represent. It's just birds are moving through, so it's a very challenging thing to get at this. All right, so when Stan got here in '59, there were not many Avocets. His book accounts for this, and he's got a publication on it, and he dug through the museum specimens at Berkeley and a few here, and showed that the first Avocets on record, at least, Humboldt Bay were in the 30s. When he arrived in '59, there were a few more, but they increased dramatically, and he linked this to the development of the sewage treatment facility at Arcata, and the oxidation ponds in particular. But there are a lot of Avocets that breed in the western United States, and then they too fan out to winter in areas as far along the coast mostly, right, in the same sort of lagoons. Note that they do not occur really north in the winter, north of Humboldt Bay. So that diversity relationship, latitude, this is one of the species that's here and not north. Right? There's two more. One of them is Willet. Right? I've got western Willet here because this is a soon-to-be split species based on this population being different from this population. 160,000 is the estimate, and they too winter in coastal areas. And this map from the Birds of North America count isn't accurately showing it as well, but Humboldt Bay is the northern location for wintering willets. Yeah, okay, there are a couple of places where you have 1 or 2 birds in Oregon and Washington, but we've got a few thousand wintering willets here, right? So there's another species. And the most interesting one, I think, is the Godwit. So this might take me a little time to get at this. The population of marbled godwits, namesake for Godwit days, consists of 2 subspecies. This prairie breeding race, which is the same, curiously, as this James Bay population, so 2,000 breed here, 170,000 estimated in the prairies of Canada and the United States. But here's the Alaskan population. That little dot right there has been a conservation challenge for folks in Alaska, but they estimate 2,000 birds. This is a different subspecies from these 2 populations. Beringia is the name for this subspecies, and it winters along the Pacific coast here, but it overlaps with birds from the prairie provinces here. They come to Humboldt Bay. Both populations, in other words, winter here. These birds are bigger. Morphologically, they're larger birds, bigger bills, longer legs than these birds, and so you can, if you had them in hand, statistically, you could sort them into this population versus this. That would be a challenge. All right, so what's interesting is that birds from western Alberta, marked birds, have been seen here at Humboldt Bay, but mostly down the coast in California here. And also these prairie birds breed all the way across they basically fan out in both an east, south, west, south, and east direction. And similarly, the James Bay birds go all over the continent to winter here, here, and here, right? This big crisscrossing web of migration. It's this population here, where if we go back to the flyway concept and the percent of a flyway population that winters or spends time at Humboldt Bay, that's the one you're going to say, wow, 2,000 birds total estimate for this population. If we're going to hang Humboldt Bay's hat as a Wissern site, as a hemispheric site, it would be that species. Two of my former students working in Alaska have radio tagged these birds, just 8 or 9 of them, and 8 of them, one was tagged at king salmon, where I used to commercial fish for salmon way back in the 70s. Guess where it wintered? King salmon, right? It's like king salmon to king salmon. Anyway, but the 8 birds that they tagged, 2 of them occurred at Humboldt Bay year after year after year. These were data loggers that loaded to satellite, so they knew exactly where the bird was, king salmon. They knew when it would leave and come back. They had these timing and schedules down. But if 2 of the 8 birds, a quarter of them, occurred at Humboldt Bay, right? If that's representative of the whole population of 2,000, that's 500 birds here. Follow my reasoning? All right, so, but that number is much bigger than that. What it points out is that we've certainly got these Alaskan birds here. We don't know how many. And yet we've got birds, they have to be prairie birds. And most of the prairie birds here, what I'm pointing out is with all of these marked individuals and studies of this species, probably one of the better known species in terms of where it breeds, subspecies, where it winters, and its movements, we still can't really put a number on what percentage of the Alaskan population winters at Humboldt Bay. My guess is a lot. Yeah, I've got 25%, but I don't. All right, so let me just finish by highlighting why this work is important. Humboldt Bay is a stupendous site for shorebirds, to study shorebirds if you're human too. But there are threats posed by, this is a photo I took under the bridge back in 97 with the Curie spill. And that's the oil slick that resulted from the 5,000 gallons of bunker C crude that leaked out of a fuel cell and into the bay, came into the bay, and then the tide took it out, and we don't know the consequences. There was another spill about 2 years later at the mouth of the bay in the jetty, about the same amount in 99, that also spilled oil in the bay. So if those tidal flats got affected, then this is the sort of things that we do. There are other things that can compromise the richness of those habitats as foraging habitats for the birds that reside here. Pollution, point source or just chronic runoff from the streets. I know people like oysters. I do too. It's a great part of our economy. And you want a sustainable mariculture to hang your hat on here. And I don't know whether it is or not. I think that term sustainable is used a little loosely, especially by proponents of longline oyster culture, but this is a form of habitat loss or subtle degradation. So if birds avoid this sort of structure and don't feed in the lanes between the longline string and hang oysters between, these happen to be covered with algae, but if you're familiar, these are the pink polygons that were numerous in the center of Arcata Bay, and there are proposals continuing to expand this aquaculture and grow more oysters. Well, just simplistically, if you're losing habitat to oyster culture, then, and the bay is full in terms of bird use, they're at a maximum, then loss of habitat translates into reduced populations of birds. I can't not raise this because the very things that create that shelf, which is the lagoon of Humboldt Bay, are part of the tectonic activity of this area. And this area is going to be affected more than any other along the coast of California and the Pacific U.S., more than any other site. In fact, it's kind of, you've heard Alderon Laird talk about what's happening or going to happen. It's a little chilling for us to consider what these consequences are of sea level rise. But imagine that the bay that you see has a valuable habitat for birds, shorebirds included, is a bathtub, and the levees, or the dikes that surround the perimeter, are the edges of the bathtub. If you start filling it up and the tide can't go out as much on a regular basis simply because of sea level rise, there's less habitat there, which requires breaching levees to create new habitat upslope. Where has that happened? The place that I mentioned where we had 100 to 200,000 western sandpipers 2 years ago at the Arcata Marsh, the McDaniel Slough Breach. That was a combined project of the City of Arcata, Cal Fish and Wildlife, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service breached the levee there, built levees behind, but they created habitat upslope, if you will. That is what you need to do to accommodate for this problem. There's still chilling consequences. So I mentioned this carrying capacity concept. It's simplistic, but if the bay and its tidal flats support the populations that I showed in that one histogram that summed to 50,000 birds of 25 species, and you consider that the food and the habitat providing the food is limiting the birds, that is that they can't support, the habitat can't support more birds, then any loss of habitat owing to mariculture, sea level rise, will result in a consequence, which is reduced population size. These are peeps, by the way, right? If you're interested in small sandpipers, looks like a mix of mostly western sandpipers in there. There's probably a dozen somewhere. So I just want to add a little intrigue to this. About 10 years ago, the trophic interactions, that is the role that sandpipers in particular play in the food webs that exist in tidal habitats, got turned on its head by high-speed cinematography, which showed, this is a western sandpiper in a series of frames ingesting mud. And it turns out that western sandpipers and other sandpipers and some plovers have brush-like tongues. And what we thought they were doing was probing into the mud for benthic invertebrates and just picking one at a time. Well, that's wrong. They use that tongue to slurp their way across the mud flat, and in some cases, better than 50%, approaching 70% of the energy intake in migration is from what is referred to as biofilm, right? Which is microbes and their associated products of slime. I'm just simplifying this, but they're basically, the sandpipers are slurping their way through this microbial community and chowing down and putting on fat to get down the road. And the reason I raise this is because it turns on its head this concept of carrying capacity based on this simple food web where shorebirds eat clams and worms and other invertebrates, which also eat biofilm. You know, if the birds are eating the biofilm directly, then there's something that we don't understand about habitat that figures hugely into their energy and the carrying capacity of the bay. So the consequences of habitat loss and degradation still hang out there as unanswered questions that I don't have another several decades to. With that, I'll take questions. I'm happy to answer any questions. No, it took a lot of coordinating, all those people, coordinating them was a challenge, and the funding, I would love to say this was citizen science, but it isn't, because I paid people. Not a ton, and I reimbursed them for their mileage, and that came from mostly the Audubon Society, right? Both the Cal Audubon, who, you know, this is where science sort of, you step over the line, and I'm not in advocacy here, but I'm providing Audubon with their ammunition to you know, use this importance argument in their litigation against the oyster industry locally, which wants to expand, right? So the funding was generous from Audubon to fund students and mostly community members, including the travel. And I mean, the funny thing is that I'm sure somebody's going to want to continue this, and I spoiled. I mean, I just ruined it because all these people who I relied on are going to expect to be paid in the future. So my guess is not. Yes.
How about acidification of the bay? How will that affect the shorebirds?
I didn't even deal with that. Acidification, and I'm not knowledgeable. My guess is that there are going to be consequences. But yeah, I understand that argument in an ocean setting, that it's drastic. And given the bay's part of it, I would say wrong.
When I'm walking around the bay and I see a big flock of shorebirds, I always say to myself, well, how many are there in there? And I say, you know, 100 or maybe 1,000. Tell us how you estimate the total number.
Well, Jamie's in lab tomorrow, but I think in a couple of weeks I train students with software, and you know, I continually ask them in the field, you know, what's that flock size? It's a talent that has to be worked on, right? So Stan used to use just still images, and he'd show people a flock of I don't know how many thousand snow geese, and you know, they would then move on to another slide and another slide. I actually have software that students laugh at, and then after about 15 minutes they get fed up. It's flocks of geese or fish swimming up the river, but the point is that it takes training, and we did train people for this, but the training involves, you know, is the flock a big flock? And if it's 1,000 birds by first guesstimate, then what you're supposed teaching you, the class here, right? But, you know, there are protocols that if it's a small flock and you can quickly estimate and then go back through and say, okay, it's 100 to 200 birds, I'm going to go through in tens and see what I get, 10, 20, 34. So you end up at 175 or something like that. The bigger the flock, the more challenging it is, and I've had flocks of, well, I mentioned 100 to 200,000 at the marsh two springs ago that, you know, all I could say is like, that was my estimate, and the other 5 or 6 people who were not talking to me, you know, when we got together, everybody had pretty much the same estimates of you know, 100,000, 150, or 200,000 using the bay. So there's nothing to say that we're all correct. Yeah, it's an art, and some people are better at it. When I estimate, you know, I routinely underestimate even small flocks of like 175. But you know, if I'm watching those Aleutian cackling geese flying over the bay and you're walking by me at the marsh on Saturday morning, it's like, if they fly over, I go, oh, 125. 10, 20, 30, 40. And Tammy's like, come on, let's keep walking. But it just takes practice. I mean, I've been in a national meeting, and this was when the U.S. Shorebird Conservation Plan was developed in early 2000 at Bodega Bay. We were sitting in a conference, and there were reputable scientists, and somebody put a flock of semi-palmated sandpipers up on the screen and asked the audience of respected biologists what the number was. Somebody said 8,000, and I went, well, 80,000. You know, that was the error from just somebody who didn't know what 80 to 100,000 looked like. It takes training. Yeah, CJ.
Is there any way to use eBird and bring it all together to carry on your censuses in future years? There's a lot of fiddle factors here.
Yeah. Audubon wanted to use eBird data that already existed for Humboldt Bay, and you know, it's problematic. The species counts that I presented, I think, are good. You know, that they're pretty close to the actual diversity, but when you get to numbers, you know, people go where there are lots of birds, and so that's a bias in itself. Right? Unless you devise some way for people in an organized fashion, like what we did, you know, with 20 people around the bay at high tide for 3 hours on these given dates, everybody's doing the same counts at the same time. You could do that and have them all enter it into eBird, but it'd be the same thing we're doing. Yeah, unfortunately, I don't see that this data will be repeated in any way anytime soon. Jake?
What are we gonna do to get it, the bay
What,
designated
there you,
Ramsar?
it's some ambitious, yeah, we'll just put it on chat again.
Okay.
And say it's time to go for Ramsar,
Yeah.
if that's what you're asking.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, the irony is, Bolinas Lagoon down the coast, Ramsar site. Why? Because CJ's got his jacket on, that point blue. It's because there's a conservation group there, including shorebird biologists, who took the initiative to nominate that tiny little lagoon as a Ramsar site, and it is, right? So all it takes is somebody nominating. And I don't know, you know, I don't know if that would add anything extra to what we already, you know, it's recognition. There isn't much, there's no teeth to Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network, no teeth whatsoever. It's just a flag you can wave. That's all it is, right? And it's an educational tool. But Ramsar, all a country has to do is designate the site and agree that they will manage it sustainably. Well, the oyster culture issue is that issue in essence, the sustainability. Is it sustainable? And I think then you get into this whole discussion about what that means. Yes?
Has there been parallel work for non-shorebirds as far as counting and?
Waterfowl, I'm going to mention Stan again, right? Stan used to do the winter flying surveys that were part of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, winter counts. So yes, waterfowl surveys exist for all species in both breeding and non-breeding season, and the obvious link to hunting, it's obvious, right? I'm looking at CJ as the passerine guy. There's nothing equivalent other than the banding work, but no, there are no point count data that are done systematically in the winter here. There are breeding season point counts that are part of a continent-wide monitoring program for songbirds, landbirds.
Well, that's where eBird can be used because it's site-specific and it's not as flexible based on time and things like that. So a few studies using eBird come out pretty good. I'd say 20–30% plus or minus. But you have to know what the habitat is, what the birds are in that habitat, then extrapolate it.
Right. So I think the difference might be that whether you get actually population counts as opposed to an index of abundance for a particular group in an area are two different things. So waterfowl, you know, there are population counts. These are population counts, albeit rough. Whereas I think the eBird point count data, et cetera, would be an index of abundance, relative abundance, not a total population size. Yes.
I'm standing
Yeah.
to say
Thank
that
you.
it's getting a little late enough that we want to release the people who need to go. I'm sure that
I'll be happy to
stay
chat
a few
if you
minutes
want.
to take a few more questions.
Thank you.